Welcome back, everybody. Thank you very much indeed. If you could take your seats, if you're standing at the back, that would be great. We can start our next session. Now, as it's already been mentioned, one of the primary local obstacles to IR 4.0 is access to funding. And most countries in the MENA region don't allow alternative financing, such as venture capital. And there are very few governmental initiatives to reduce the rather risk-averse nature of traditional financiers, such as banks, in order to encourage investment in startups and entrepreneurs. So in this session, Richard Quest and his distinguished panellists will be discussing perspectives of the global ecosystem and funding challenges. So, Richard Quest, can I ask you to join us on the stage, please? Thank you very much. Round of applause for Richard. I hope you're sufficiently rested after your session just now. I'd also like to invite our panellists to join Richard. His Highness Sheikh Salman bin Khalifa Al Khalifa, the Bahraini Minister of Finance and National Economy. His Excellency Dr. Mazin Souied, who's Chairman and General Manager of the Investment Development Authority of Lebanon. And our final panellist is the CEO and Executive Director of Zamel Industrial Investment Company, Mr. Abdullah Mohammed Al-Zamel.
We are discussing the funding for the fourth industrial revolution and the various mechanisms that can be employed. And obviously we'll be talking to you, sir, about what's happening in your country at the moment. Let's begin with you, though, Minister, about the environment, the funding environment. The first panel was very much about the issues of policy, encouragement, but now we come to the hard cash.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Richard, and it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to Bahrain. For those who are here for the first time, hope you come back many times, and for everybody else, welcome back. Funding is critical in the economy to ensure that ideas and innovation and expansion and growth continues. It is the lifeline. And it is one of the most important aspects of any economy is to ensure that cash flow remains unaffected and growing regardless of what's happening economically. In the Kingdom of Bahrain, there have been many initiatives to ensure that access to capital is eased, and many initiatives to make sure that whether it's entrepreneurs starting out, whether it's large-scale companies, that they have access to capital as they need it for expansion and growth. We have a very active banking sector for many years, but a very active banking sector does not in itself ensure that capital gets to, for example, entrepreneurs at early stages of development. So many vehicles were put in place, but the most important of which that has been quite transformative in Bahrain is Tamkeen, the labor fund. And Tamkeen collects all of the labor fees from the private sector. 20% of it goes to the government, and 80% is reinvested through programs to companies starting out for training of Bahrainis.
To what purpose?
One, to ensure entrepreneurial development is happening, so capital for growth for companies, and the second is for training Bahrainis and training the workforce, in recognition of the fact that our most important resource is our people.
How much of that retraining, as we were talking in the earlier sessions, how much of it is for fresh training, if you like, and retraining for a workforce that won't be in the jobs that they're in today?
Well, that depends on the cycle, but it is for both.
And what do you see as government's role in this?
Most importantly, to ensure that capital continues to flow where the business sector decides it needs to go. When you have a thriving banking sector that is predominantly owned by the private sector, then those decisions become commercial decisions. And when the government gets out of the way, the decisions become purely commercial and things work. And so you just need, but at the same time, from a regulatory perspective, there's an important role to be played by any government to ensure that the regulations, the business processes are easy. So the ease of doing business becomes extremely important. And here, at the Arab Businessmen and Investors Conference, we should be very proud of the fact that the World Doing Business report from the World Bank that came out this year, 4 of the top 10 reformers in the world were from this region. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Kingdom of Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan. And that shows the speed at which governments are moving in terms of reorganizing a lot of the business processes and approval processes that the business sector has to go through to expand and build.
In terms of the private sector and the banking private sector, you cover both for us in that sense. What do you see as being the opportunities necessary from the banking sector?
Well, as His Excellency said, the banking sector did play a major role in the growth in the past 50 years. Traditional business have benefited tremendously from that sector. Given the new entry of technology, fourth industrial revolution, we definitely need an alternative source of funding. And that would only come...
I'm going to stop you and take this bit by bit. You're saying we definitely need an alternative source of funding.
Yes.
Why?
Doing business nowadays, traditional funding, as His Excellency said, have played a major role in the mega projects and mainly large companies. But when it comes to small and medium-sized enterprise, I think we still lag behind. Just a quick statistics. In the MENA region, 96% of businesses are small and medium enterprises. Only 7% of total bank funding is allocated to those types of businesses. In comparison, Asia Pacific, 16% of total bank funding is allocated to small and medium-sized enterprises.
Why in this part of the world, to either of you, why in this part of the world would that necessarily be a lower number? Excellency.
Because failure was a criminal offense and still is in many countries.
In this country?
Bankruptcy law now changed that. So the Kingdom of Bahrain issued a bankruptcy law.
Oh, you mean literally a criminal offense?
It was literally a criminal offense if you owned a business that failed. And now, that was why the importance of bankruptcy law. So what that did was it made a lot of lenders shy away from companies that were small or unproven, and there was a lot of personal lending that was attached to companies. But as you really protect assets and ring-fence them and introduce bankruptcy laws and, in effect, decriminalize failure, then you ensure that you're opening up capital to those segments of the market.
I mean, bankruptcy law is one thing, but also we need a regulatory framework for competition, for intellectual property right, real estate. So it's a holistic view that needs to be looked at the regulatory reform.
Now, let's return to Lebanon. I suppose our discussion of Lebanon has to begin with the current situation, which by any definition is not good. Hang on, we're not hearing you. This gentleman, just keep going.
Yes, now?
Yes, there we go.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think now, ironically, Lebanon is it's going through a kind of a 4.0 revolution itself. This is not a revolution about political representation. This is not a revolution about social inclusion. This is not even a revolution about economic empowerment. This is a revolution about messing up with the social media generation. A revolution that started with a 20-cent tax on WhatsApp and triggered basically amazing outrage that started amongst the youth and then spread. And now the biggest demand of the revolution is about corruption, is about access to data, access to information, and it's about getting back the money that people think was mismanaged or spent in the wrong places. So I think
it's important, bearing in mind we've just raised this, but I won't dwell on it too long.
Yes.
But I think it is important that we know the position from which you speak.
Yes.
Do you speak as a representative of the government? Do you speak as a representative of the sort of the quasi-government private sector? Where do you stand?
Well, first I am the newly appointed chairman of the Investment Promotion Agency, which is a government body, right? And basically with some kind of autonomy because it has to deal with attracting investment like any other investment promotion agency. But also for a very long time, I'm an economist and I'm an observer. Do
you expect to be in your job a long time?
Yes. No, I think there is a recognition among the political class, and every single leader actually in Lebanon has come up and said the revolution requests and the revolution demands are legitimate, you know. So,
but how can you, in your current role, ask anybody to invest in Lebanon at the moment? Doesn't it beg a belief to sort of say to somebody, we'd like you to make a multi-million-dollar investment in a country that might, God forbid, explode into who knows what?
Well, one of my objectives for IDAL and my vision is that starts with a simple question: what can you sell in Lebanon? Political instability, a macroeconomic framework that is no longer working, a currency pegged to the dollar that looks shaky. What can you actually sell? Well, you can sell human resources, Lebanese talent, Lebanese entrepreneurship, Lebanon as potentially an outsourcing hub for tech companies. And there is several success stories. Unbelievable, you know. Entrepreneurs in Lebanon operating out of the basements of their own houses and manufacturing semiconductors and selling them to Facebook and to Google and to basically top tech companies. And for those, actually, to open an outsourcing hub in Lebanon and hire engineers and software developers and graphic designers that cost you significantly less than what they cost you in India or China, we're not even talking about Europe or the US, is a very good business proposition, I think, because you are developing products to be sold abroad.
One more question to you on this, and then we'll move on. But this is all fine and good. But as the Minister, His Excellency was saying, you've got to put in place the necessary policies that will, I would initially say, facilitate, which would then go on to encourage and innovate.
Yes.
Laws.
Absolutely. Laws, no, look, Lebanon has good laws. The law 360 that established IDAL, the Investment Promotion Agency, which was written in 2001, was one of the first investment promotion laws in the region. And actually, it allowed the investment authority to invest seed capital in startups ahead of anybody else in the region. Recently, a few years ago, the Central Bank of Lebanon, through circular that was named 331, allowed banks to invest also seed capital out of their own capital, and it opened $650 million potentially to investment in startups.
Where do you stand on seed capital, Minister? Where do you see, in terms of the government's ability to, I use the phrase, pick winners?
No, I support seed capital.
You do?
But it's important to ensure that the vehicles that are set up are vehicles that are operating on a competitive and commercial basis. Otherwise, you will end up directing investment and good money towards investments that are maybe not the most commercially viable ones. And therefore, the vehicle through which you deploy seed capital becomes critical. So in the Kingdom of Bahrain, with the Economic Development Board spearhead and launched a fund of venture capital funds. And the idea behind that was to allow fund managers to make their decisions on a commercial basis, and you'd seed those fund managers.
But the capital and cash for the seed capital comes from yourselves?
It comes from the government, yes. Well, it came from a variety of investors, some of which invest the pension fund money and some of which invest some of the government money. So it came from a variety of sources. Recently, for example, the government has launched a liquidity fund. The liquidity fund has nothing to do with seed capital, but has to do with allowing and giving some respite to companies that are facing temporary working capital constraints, and are working with the Bahrain Chamber for Commerce and Industry on ensuring that the deployment of that money is done in a competitive manner and done on a commercial basis.
And does the government, do you, I suppose, as the representative, get to say, we'll go there, we won't go there, we'll put it in this one, we won't put it in that one?
Well, you would hope not, because you would want to ensure that those decisions are decisions that are made, as I said, again, on a much more commercial basis. So the government may identify the problem,
right,
work with many of the stakeholders to identify the problem, may work on putting together a solution, but the individual allocations should be something that is a very commercial approach.
What are some of the problems that have led to funding incapacity?
Well, firstly, there are some structural ones, as Abdullah mentioned. There are some structural issues that have faced the small to medium enterprises around the way in which our lending systems and banking systems and legal framework was set up. And as we look to address those through things like the bankruptcy law or increasing risk appetite through things like the venture capital fund initiatives such as that. And the second issue with regards to dislocations is led by working capital constraints. Those working capital constraints came from a variety of different reasons, some of which included cost of doing business has gone up in some parts of the region.
Let me interject here for a moment, Richard.
Sure.
This is the vicious circle we need to get out of in the region here, and that is expecting the government to play a major role in funding small and medium enterprises.
Sorry.
At the very beginning, I would agree. But at some point in time, the government needs to retract and allow alternative funding to be the major force behind the growth of SMEs. Peer-to-peer electronic funding needs to be in place. Seed funding through venture capital, private sector driven. And in the previous panel, His Excellency talked about sandbox in Bahrain. I think Bahrain has gone a long way in being at the forefront of allowing fintechs to register, create a proper regulatory environment. This is exactly what government needs to concentrate on, a regulatory framework to be conducive for private funders to come in and drive the business.
Yes, I would like to say something about that, because I think government and funding just don't work, regardless of what sectors we are talking about. I am personally a student of the Asian financial crisis back in '97 when I was at Brown University writing my PhD, and I wrote about that financial crisis. And then I worked later at the IMF in Washington, D.C., trying to fix these kind of crises. And I saw firsthand the danger of directed lending. When the government believes in Korea that the Shaibul should be getting those lending and that kind of funding. And these are basically companies that are heroes of the 2.0 and 3.0 revolution, not industrial revolution, not just the 4.0. And now I think it is a big danger if we think that it is the sector that matters. No, human nature is the same. It is about human nature. We make mistakes. Crony capitalism is the same, regardless of whether it's 2.0, 3.0, or 4.0. The job of the government is to enable but it's the job of the private sector. And if startups ultimately cannot find a venture capital or a private equity that is owned and managed by the private sector, it shouldn't exist.
Except if there's a problem with the private sector finding venture capital because, for whatever reason, it's not available in the country.
Yes, of course.
Which is what you're suggesting, is that the structural framework of funding in this part of the world is not conducive.
Let me give you an example. If you were to look at the US and Europe, as the regulatory framework for banks became more cumbersome, more stricter, what emerged was hedge funds that would arrange private lending even for large companies, in addition to the venture capital funds that had been around for a while and seed capital. But I'm talking even for some of the significant borrowers, the syndicated loan market in the US and Europe started becoming smaller and was being replaced by private financing by hedge funds. That doesn't exist in our part of the world, and hasn't existed in our part of the world. Why? Because we haven't had a very big hedge fund industry that has attracted a lot of capital to deploy in this part of the world with a lot of flexibility. Therefore, some of these initiatives that have to happen are initiatives that need to come from the private sector.
Right, but those hedge funds that are not here, why are they not here?
They have not been operating in this part of the world traditionally, neither in the listed or private markets, and therefore that evolution never happened for them to step into and take advantage of.
But you're not against them being here. So what I'm trying to understand is, as these hedge funds in other parts of the world developed and invested and looked elsewhere, was there something in the regulatory or structural environment in this part of the world, in the Gulf, that made them think, hang on, we don't find it attractive?
I think so, yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. I mean,
which was what?
As His Excellency said, the bankruptcy law was only passed in the past 12 months, even in the bigger market, which is Saudi Arabia. That by in itself, in my opinion, requires, it's a maturity issue at the end of the day. We, as markets, are evolving quicker than a lot of people have expected, especially in the past 24 months, I would say, in the region here, Dubai, Bahrain, Saudi. Yeah. You're seeing regulations. Actually, today, and I'll say this, I come from the private sector, and we're having issues catching up with governments. That is true. This has not been the case, I would say, 2 years ago. Today, governments are ahead of private sector when it comes to digitization. You see e-government today across the board.
Right.
We see them adopting the latest technologies. The private sector, in my opinion, is still going through the cycles, the economic cycles of up and down. Today, we're slightly at the downturn. We will probably catch up. But the government is moving fast, and I think we need to catch up. On the regulatory framework side, I think there is still room to improve.
But on the funding side?
On the funding side, at the beginning, I'll give you an example. Saudi created a 4 billion Riyal fund of funds owned by PIF. That is fine. And I think this is excellent to kickstart. But there needs to be an end to this game. There needs to be a time frame where government pulls back, private sector comes in, and possibly, as His Excellency said, hedge funds. It's a maturity issue, I think. But we're moving there.
But if I may, you want to give somebody a good reason to lend you money? You should be the reason. So there has to be an idea.
Like any, the analogy that's always given, it's very, like any drug addict, it's very difficult to wean somebody off something that they are used to. So an environment where there has been a regular drip feed of government money supporting business at one scope, failing or otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to change.
No, but let me explain. What I mean is, if you give young entrepreneurs the ability to put together strong business plans, those strong business plans will attract the capital. Yeah. Capital is a commodity. So there is capital to be deployed. There is capital to be deployed in the banking sector. There's capital to be deployed in the private sector. So there is this capital to be deployed, but it needs the ideas and the professional opportunities to which to deploy.
So, plus, do you think, Richard, that in the age of crowdfunding and in the age of shadow banking, today a brilliant idea does not get, in one way or another, funded to be materialized?
So what about the competition that will naturally be generated between the various countries for innovative companies, to attract talent? We talked earlier about the sandbox. The beauty of this part of the world is, maybe with the exception of Saudi Arabia, but there's lots of relatively small countries that can act as a sandbox. We have two of them on the panel here. Do you see yourself in competition?
But the way that the regulatory sandbox works is that we have a very conservative banking regulatory environment. We're very proud of the strong regulatory framework in place by the central bank. And to protect that, while at the same time allowing innovation and testing and trying some new things, without impacting or affecting the traditional banking system, the idea for the regulatory sandbox was born. So you have to prove yourself, and if things go well, then you graduate out of the sandbox into the normal area. So creating that ring-fenced sandbox was really a way to ensure that we're protecting the banking system while allowing innovation to be unleashed.
Are you in competition as a country with your neighbours for ideas and companies to come and try out in your regulatory sandbox?
I would say that there are many examples of very complementary economic. So economic development and positive economic development in our part of the world is quite contagious.
I think absolutely the key word is complementarity rather than competition. And let me give you our experience in Lebanon, where lots of funding was available. As I said, $650 million were released from banks to entrepreneurs. This led to mushrooming of entrepreneurs. Today we have an ecosystem of $1 billion employing 2,000 people. But if you look at the success stories, very few success stories.
Why?
Why? Because many of these entrepreneurs could not scale up. And when you ask them why, they said because we live in a fragmented region, very highly regulated, and when they were comparing themselves to their entrepreneurs equivalent in Europe, where the laws are unified, there are no trade restrictions, there are the same standards to entry, it was very, very difficult to survive.
I don't have to be politically correct, so I can speak my mind. When it comes to competition, and I'll give it to you, I'm not from Bahrain, I live in Saudi. Bahrain is ahead of the curve. I think the work between, and I've tried this personally, registering fintechs in Bahrain is probably the easiest in the region. There's a seamless work between the Economic Development Board of Bahrain and the Central Bank of Bahrain. And I've tried to register a fintech company in few countries in the region, and I think Bahrain is way ahead of the rest. And I'll give it to you. I'm looking for a free dinner tonight. That's
You've got it, brother.
Got it. Done. But having said that, at the end of the day, Bahrain is a small economy that serves the neighborhood and is a service center for the economies in the region, and therefore positive economic development in our neighborhood is something that is positive for Bahrain. But I do want to touch upon an important thing that did happen a few years ago. His Royal Highness the Crown Prince established the Small and Medium Enterprise Committee, which is chaired by the Minister of Commerce. And that committee put in place they were given three priorities. Number one, access to capital. Ease access to capital for small businesses. Mm-hmm. Number two, give support to businesses to scale up, because some businesses would start, and then if they weren't able to scale up, they would die. And the third is decriminalize failure. And we've worked through these three major columns to ensure that we have initiatives on each one that we've been ticking away. And thank you, Abdullah, for the validation of some of the work that was being done.
Well, let me lose my free dinner and say that no country in this region is big enough to basically be a global powerhouse alone. in innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology. And if we don't, as an Arab region, learn from the mistake of Industrial Revolution 2.0 and 3.0, and if we don't integrate economically, if we don't tear down our barriers, you know, the visas, the trade restrictions, the everything, I think we will miss Industrial Revolution 4.0.
If I may just add to that, you know, our private sector in our part of the world, if I may say so, largely missed out on Industrial Revolution 2.0 and 3.0. Because if you were to look at the structure of our private sectors, then large-scale industrial development in an economy was typically government-led. They were government-led industrial enterprises, government-led industrial companies. And our private sector was much more focused on construction or import businesses. And therefore, when it comes to Industrial Revolution 4.0, we need to ensure that our private sector is taking on a much larger role in driving the innovation and being a participant in
Can the private sector do it?
Yes, absolutely. And you know why, Richard?
Go on.
Because I can tell you that the most important resource in our region, and this is uniform across all of the countries I've been in the region, is our people. If you were to look at the young Bahrainis, Saudis, Kuwaitis, Emiratis, Lebanese, and you look at the level of education, you look at the ability to the work ethic, you look at it is something that we should be very happy and very comfortable knowing that this is what will enable our region to succeed.
But those guys, they need a much larger playing field that can be provided by their own countries.
Just get out of their way.
How willing is the region at government level? Do you think, bearing in mind two of you are from government, so you have a vested interest in that sense, but how willing is government to get out of the way, really get out of the way? Not just pay lip service to it, but actually break down those barriers. Single market type of barriers.
Well, you know, integration across markets is something that's different. But I'll give you an example locally with regards in Bahrain, and you know, we did two major, and we're working on others, but I'll just focus on, and we've done others, but I'll focus just on two, was what we did with the commercial registrations and what we did with the building permits. In both cases, we were minimizing the government's role. The building permits, for example, why do you need a government engineer on a government payroll to check every drawing for every building being built? You don't need that. What we did was we got together different government entities, and we put in place a law and the regulations required to allow engineering firms to check on each other. So that's a great example of the government getting out of the way. Can I give you the result? Forget the process. Let's talk about the result. Whereas a building permit would take over 160 days to be issued in Bahrain, after we changed this and managed to minimize the government's role, it was down to 2.7 days, from 160 days to 2.7 days. It shows you how effective...
And no buildings have fallen down.
Yeah.
We'll find out. No, but and all the government's role changed to, at that point, and in all seriousness, the government's role changed to the government engineers would audit the firms. So there was a responsibility, and there is a legal responsibility, and there is oversight.
We're coming to the end of time. Maybe one question, two questions, if anybody is eager.
Let me just on the issue of integration. I think we should pursue the path with least resistance, which is capital markets. Because the capital markets are well governed, compliance issues are being looked at, I think they should be the ones that should be pursued first, to be integrated, and then we would go to other issues.
Let me give you a small example. You know, Lebanon, something happened between Lebanon and Turkey 10 years ago. They just canceled the visa requirement. Out in Turkey and Lebanon. Wonders happened in 10 years. You know, if you look at the trade relationship, multiplied by 10. The tourist arrival by 20. You know, the business interconnectivity. Multiples. You're talking about multiple effects. And this is a country with which we don't share the language, we don't share the culture, we don't share borders. Imagine the possibilities that are inherent in the Arab world. One language, one culture, and basically natural complementarity.
Final question. Imagine I've given you a magic wand, and with a wave of that wand, you can make one change. Just one change. Start with you. What change? Magic wand. One change that would help promote what we're talking about.
Education.
What would you do?
I would really like to see the outcome of our education system better than what we have today.
Right, but what change are you going to make that happen?
I don't have all the answers, but I know what the problem is. I'll leave it to the audience to have answers.
Very wise. One change.
In and out of any Arab country without a visa.
Say that again.
The ability to get into any Arab country without a visa.
Right. I said a magic wand, not a miracle.
Well, if magic wands don't do miracles.
Minister, you've got my magic wand. One change.
I think more integration across the region with regards to the economy. It's similar to...
Oh, you also want to get rid of the visa?
More integration. I think it gives larger economic opportunity for all of our private sector. In some cases, is something that would open up. And seeing a larger market develop across the region in a seamless way would be wonderful.
So in 5 years' time, when I'm back here talking to you, and you're still minister, we'll have seen that change.
Let's see.
Thank you. The panel. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you.